There is a place on this planet where the sky is a different color. Not blue the way the sky is blue anywhere else. Darker, deeper, almost violet at altitude because the air is so thin and the atmosphere is so compressed that the light that reaches you has traveled through less of the planet's atmosphere than anywhere else you will ever stand. There is a place where the holiest mountain in the world has never been climbed. Not because it is too difficult, because no one is permitted. Because the mountain is sacred to 4 of the world's great religions simultaneously, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Bon, and the summit, in every one of those traditions, is the dwelling place of something that does not belong to us. There is a place where monks have been chanting the same prayers in the same buildings, in the same language for 1500 years, where a library of manuscripts contains wisdom accumulated before the printing press existed, before the Americas were discovered, before the modern world had any concept of what it was going to become, where pilgrims walk for weeks across some of the highest terrain on Earth to prostrate themselves before a statue that has been in the same spot since the 7th century. That place is Tibet. And right now, as you watch this, it is in the process of being erased. Not in the metaphorical sense. Not gradually, as cultures are always gradually changed by contact with the outside world. Deliberately, systematically, with the full administrative and military apparatus of the most powerful authoritarian government on Earth. This is the story of what Tibet is, what it holds, what is being lost, and why every person on this planet should understand what is happening on the roof of the world. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of storytelling you came to YouTube for, subscribe to Rome Folios right now. We go where the world forgets to look. Every week, a place that deserves more than a headline. Hit subscribe, this is important. Let's start with the geography. Because the geography of Tibet is not merely context. It is the reason for everything that follows. The Tibetan Plateau is the largest and highest plateau on Earth. An area of approximately 2.5 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe, sitting at an average elevation of over 4,500 meters above sea level. 4,500 meters. That is higher than the summit of Mont Blanc, the highest peak in the Alps. And it is the average elevation of the plateau floor. The mountains that rim it, the Himalayas to the south, the Karakoram to the west, the Kunlun and Tangula ranges to the north and east are higher still. Everest stands on its southern edge, K2 on its western. 14 of the world's 15 highest mountains are within its borders or on its perimeter. The Tibetan Plateau was formed by the collision of the Indian tectonic plate with the Eurasian plate, a collision that began approximately 50 million years ago and has never stopped. The plates are still moving, the plateau is still rising by a few millimeters each year, pushed up by the geological force of a continent pressing against a continent. It is the most dramatic geological event in the recent history of the Earth's surface, and it is happening right now, underneath the feet of the people who live there. The altitude changes everything. The air at 4,500 meters contains roughly half the oxygen of air at sea level. Visitors from lower elevations spend their first days incapacitated headaches, dizziness, nausea, the particular exhaustion of a body working twice as hard to extract the oxygen it needs from every breath. Tibetans have adapted over thousands of years. Their blood contains more hemoglobin than the blood of people at lower altitudes. Their hearts are larger, proportionally. Their lung capacity is greater. They are, genetically, a different kind of human being, adapted by tens of thousands of years of high altitude living into something that lowlanders cannot replicate by training or by acclimatization. When Tibetan athletes compete at low altitudes, they perform extraordinarily. When lowlander soldiers are stationed at Tibetan altitudes, as the Chinese military has been for decades, they struggle. The plateau does not accommodate outsiders easily. It never has. And it has shaped, in its resistance and its extremity and its specific quality of light and air and silence, a civilization unlike any other on Earth. The great rivers of Asia begin in Tibet. This is not a metaphor. The Yangtze, the Yellow River, the Mekong, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, the Indus, the Irrawaddy, 7 of Asia's greatest rivers, the water systems that sustain the agriculture, the cities, the daily lives of approximately 1.8 billion people, originate in the glaciers and snowfields of the Tibetan Plateau. 1/4 of the human race depends for its water on what falls as snow in Tibet and melts slowly through its river systems toward the sea. The Tibetan Plateau has been called the third pole not because of its latitude, but because of the volume of freshwater ice it holds outside the Arctic and Antarctic. It contains approximately 46,000 glaciers. Those glaciers are retreating at a rate that scientists describe consistently as alarming. The implications for the rivers, for the agricultural systems they feed, for the 1.8 billion people downstream are among the most significant environmental concerns on Earth. But the water is not the only thing Tibet holds. Beneath the plateau surface, under the monasteries, under the prayer flags, under the yak pastures, there are mineral reserves of extraordinary value. Lithium, copper, gold, iron, chromite, uranium. The lithium reserves alone essential for the batteries that power the electric vehicles the world is pivoting toward are among the largest known deposits on the planet. Tibet is not just the roof of the world. It is the floor of the global economy's future. And it is controlled completely, absolutely, under conditions that would not be recognized as legitimate by the international community if applied anywhere else on Earth by the People's Republic of China. To understand what Tibet is, what it was before 1950, and what it still is, beneath the surface of what it has been made to become, you have to understand the sacred, not as a cultural curiosity, not as something belonging to another people's tradition, interesting but remote. The sacred in Tibet is the organizing principle of everything: architecture, agriculture, medicine, art. Time itself measured not in secular years but in 60-year cycles, each year named for an animal and an element, each day containing auspicious and inauspicious hours determined by a cosmological calendar of extraordinary complexity. The sacred is not a department of Tibetan life. It is the foundation on which every other department is built. Lhasa. The name means, in Tibetan, place of the gods. It has been the capital of Tibet, the religious and political center of the civilization since the 7th century, when the great king Songtsen Gampo unified the Tibetan tribes and established a kingdom that would, at its height, extend from northern India to the Tang Dynasty heartland of China. Songtsen Gampo built the first version of what would become the Jokhang Temple in the center of Lhasa, a structure containing the Jowo Rinpoche, a statue of the Buddha as a young prince, brought to Tibet as part of a political marriage alliance and considered by Tibetan Buddhists to be the most sacred object in their world. The Jowo Rinpoche has been in Lhasa for 1400 years. It survived the Mongol invasions. It survived the chaos of inter-dynasty struggles. It survived the Cultural Revolution barely, hidden, protected by Tibetans at enormous personal risk. it is still there, in the innermost sanctuary of the Jokhang, surrounded by butter lamps that have been burning with brief interruptions for over 1,000 years. The pilgrims who come to circumambulate the Jokhang, walking the bark horse circuit, the ancient market street that rings the temple, spinning prayer wheels as they go, have been doing so since the 7th century. The circuit has been walked so many times by so many people over so many centuries that the stones of the bark horse are polished, smooth, worn down not by time but by footsteps, by devotion made physical and accumulated over a millennium and a half. Above the old city of Lhasa, on a rocky hill called Marpori, the red hill, the Potala Palace rises. It is one of the most extraordinary buildings on earth. Not for its age, though parts of it date to the 7th century. Not for its size, though it has over 1,000 rooms and rises 13 stories from the rock on which it sits. But for what it is, the Potala is simultaneously a palace, a monastery, a fortress, a library, and a reliquary, the physical container of the spiritual authority of the Dalai Lamas, the God Kings of Tibet, each one considered to be the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of compassion. The building is red and white, its colors carrying specific symbolic weight in Tibetan Buddhist iconography: red for power and protection, white for peace. It contains the tombs of 8 Dalai Lamas, each one a stupa of gold and precious stones rising through multiple floors of the interior. It contains chapels whose walls are covered in murals, painted by artists whose names were not recorded, in paint mixed with ground minerals and precious stones, and a visual tradition that encodes entire systems of Buddhist philosophy in image rather than text. It contains a library of thousands of texts, some of them unique, some of them the only surviving copies of works composed in monasteries that no longer exist. The Potala was the seat of Tibetan government for over 3 centuries. In 1959, the 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso fled from it in the middle of the night, disguised as a soldier, crossing the Himalaya on foot to reach India ahead of the Chinese forces that were closing in. He has not returned. He has been in exile for over 60 years. He is now in his late 80s. And the question of what happens when the current Dalai Lama dies, who will identify and recognize his reincarnation, by whose authority, under whose control, is one of the most consequential and most contested religious and political questions in the world today. 400 kilometers to the west of Lhasa, in one of the most remote and least accessible corners of the Tibetan plateau, a mountain rises from the flat expanse of the Barka Plain, 6,638 meters above sea level. Its summit is a perfect pyramid of rock and ice, symmetrical almost beyond what geology normally produces. Its name, in Tibetan, is Gang Rinpoche, Precious Snow Mountain, in Sanskrit, Kailash. Mount Kailash is the most sacred mountain in the world, not according to one religion, according to 4. For Tibetan Buddhists, Kailash is the home of Demchok, the deity of supreme bliss and the spiritual center of the universe. For Hindus, it is the throne of Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, and the source of the 4 great rivers of Indian cosmology. For Jains, it is the site where Rishabhanatha, the first of the 24 Tirthankaras, achieved liberation. For practitioners of Bon, the pre-Buddhist spiritual tradition of Tibet, it is the seat of all spiritual power, the axis around which the world turns. 4 religions. 1 mountain, the holiest site in the world that almost no one in the Western world has heard of. No one has ever stood on the summit of Kailash, not because the climbing is beyond human capability, at 6,638 meters, It is challenging but not extreme by modern mountaineering standards. Because it is forbidden, the mountain is not climbed. The mountain is circumambulated. The Kora, the pilgrimage circuit around the base of Kailash, is approximately 52 kilometers long. It crosses a high pass at over 5,600 meters. It takes most pilgrims 3 days to complete. Some complete it in a single day. The most devout complete it by full body prostration, lying flat on the ground, marking the spot where their fingers touch, rising, walking to that mark, lying flat, again, a process that takes between 3 weeks and 3 months. They do this because the mountain is sacred, because the act of circumambulation itself is a form of prayer, because the effort is the offering. And around the base of this mountain, at 4,600 meters of altitude, in a landscape of extraordinary austerity and extraordinary beauty, pilgrims from 4 religions, from across Asia, walk together. Hindus from India, Tibetan Buddhists from what remains of Free Tibet and from the diaspora, Jains, Bon practitioners, walking the same path, in the same direction, in the same silence. It is one of the most remarkable things that happens on this planet, every day, unwitnessed by most of the world. The lake adjacent to Kailash Manasarovar sits at 4,590 meters and is considered, in Hindu tradition, to be the highest freshwater lake in the world and one of the most sacred bodies of water in existence. Its name means mind lake in Sanskrit, the lake created, according to legend, in the mind of Brahma. At dawn, when the surface of Manasarovar is still and the light is coming in low and horizontal from the east, Kailash reflects in the water, the mountain and its reflection, the sacred and its shadow. It is a composition that no photographer has ever managed to improve upon, because it was already perfect. In the great monastery of Sera, on the outskirts of Lhasa, something happens every afternoon that has been happening for centuries. The monks debate, not quietly, not in the cloistered library silence of a Western academic tradition. They debate in a courtyard, standing, moving, punctuating their philosophical arguments with physical gestures, a slap of one palm against the other to emphasize a point, a sweep of the prayer beads, a stomp of the foot. The debates concern the most fundamental questions of Buddhist philosophy: the nature of consciousness, the existence of the self, the relationship between perception and reality. Questions that Western philosophy has been wrestling with since Descartes, that neuroscience is now approaching from a different angle, that artificial intelligence researchers are beginning to take seriously as they build systems that process information without being conscious. These monks have been working on these questions for 1,500 years. They have developed a tradition of philosophical inquiry, madhyamaka, yogacara, pramana, of extraordinary sophistication, encoded in a literature that fills entire libraries and that has been studied, translated, and increasingly recognized by Western scientists as containing insights that complement and sometimes anticipate their own findings. The Dalai Lama has been in dialogue with neuroscientists, physicists, and psychologists for decades, not as a public relations exercise, but as a genuine intellectual exchange in which both sides believe they have something to learn from the other. The Mind and Life Institute, which facilitates these dialogues, has produced research that has changed the way neuroscience understands meditation, attention, and the relationship between mental practice and brain structure. This tradition of inquiry, 15 centuries of accumulated philosophical and psychological knowledge, exists in a language spoken by approximately 6 million people. In a country that is in the process of being systematically absorbed into a civilization that does not value it. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army of the newly established People's Republic of China crossed the border into Tibet. The Tibetan army, small, under-equipped, and organized around a military tradition that had not been tested in serious combat in decades, offered what resistance it could. It was not enough. By 1951, the Chinese government and representatives of the Tibetan government had signed a document, the 17-Point Agreement, that formally incorporated Tibet into the People's Republic of China. The Tibetan representatives who signed it later testified that they did so under duress. The seals used to authenticate the document were, some accounts suggest, fabricated by the Chinese side. The agreement was presented to the Tibetan government after the fact. Whether it constituted a legitimate treaty or an imposed capitulation remains contested. What is not contested is what followed. The first years of Chinese administration were relatively controlled. The existing Tibetan governmental and religious structures were nominally maintained, and the 14th Dalai Lama remained in Lhasa, attempting to negotiate some accommodation between Tibetan autonomy and Chinese authority. Then came the Cultural Revolution. Between 1966 and 1976, the Red Guards and their Tibetan collaborators systematically destroyed the physical infrastructure of Tibetan civilization. Of the approximately 6,000 monasteries that existed in Tibet before 1950, fewer than a dozen survived the Cultural Revolution intact. The rest were looted, demolished, repurposed as military barracks, granaries, pig farms, prisons. The libraries were burned. The statues were melted down for the metal, mostly. The monks were forced to denounce their practice, to marry, to eat meat, to participate in their own cultural destruction. Those who refused were imprisoned. Some were executed. The scale of destruction is comparable to the burning of the Library of Alexandria, except that the Library of Alexandria burned once. The monasteries of Tibet burned over 10 years, systematically, with bureaucratic efficiency. Since the end of the Cultural Revolution, a partial reconstruction has been permitted enough to serve the tourist economy that the Chinese government has developed around Tibetan cultural sites, not enough to restore the full depth of what was lost. And the control has never relaxed. Photographs of the Dalai Lama are prohibited in Tibet. Possessing one is grounds for arrest. Speaking publicly in favor of Tibetan independence, or even of the autonomy that China nominally promised in 1951, is treated as separatism and prosecuted accordingly. Monks in the major monasteries of Tibet are required to undergo regular political education sessions in which they must denounce the Dalai Lama as a splittist and affirm their loyalty to the Chinese state. Cameras and surveillance infrastructure in Lhasa are extensive. Foreign visitors who require special permits to enter Tibet at all, permits that are granted or denied without explanation and revoked without notice, report being monitored constantly. Tibetan activists have been arrested for sending text messages, for singing traditional songs, for wearing the Tibetan flag as a badge. The surveillance is not subtle. It is designed to be seen, because the point is not only to monitor. The point is to make monitoring visible, to make it felt, to make the space of Tibetan cultural expression smaller and smaller and smaller, until the expression itself requires an act of courage that most people, understandably, cannot sustain. If you are still watching, and I want you to stay, because what comes next is not just about Tibet, it is about all of us. Subscribe to Rome Folios right now. This is the kind of story we tell every week. Hit subscribe, then keep going. But the tradition resists. It always has. In Dharamsala, in the foothills of the Indian Himalayas, a city in exile has been building itself since 1959. When the Dalai Lama crossed the Himalaya on foot, in the dark, in late March, over passes that were still deep in snow. Approximately 80,000 Tibetans followed him into exile in the months and years that followed. They established schools, monasteries, printing presses, medical colleges, performing arts institutions. They created, in a corner of northern India, a replica of the civilization they had been forced to leave, not as a museum piece, but as a living tradition. The Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala holds over 80,000 manuscripts and texts, some of them rescued from Tibet at enormous personal risk, smuggled out under clothing, hidden in the linings of bags, carried across mountain passes by people who knew that being caught would mean imprisonment. The manuscripts were treated as more important than the people carrying them, because the people could eventually be replaced. The texts could not. Tibetan medicine, a system developed over 15 centuries, drawing on Indian Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, and a specifically Tibetan understanding of the relationship between mind, body, and environment, is being systematically studied and preserved by the Menti Kang, the Tibetan Medical and Astrological Institute in Dharamsala. Its practitioners work in exile, training students in traditions that were nearly destroyed in Tibet itself, sending graduates back into the Tibetan diaspora communities in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and further abroad. The tradition continues, slowly, imperfectly, under conditions that no tradition should have to survive. But it continues. The reincarnation system, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of identifying the reincarnation of deceased lamas, including the Dalai Lama himself, through a process of spiritual discernment, testing, and recognition, is the most politically contentious religious practice in the world today. Not because the practice is violent, not because it threatens anyone's physical safety, but because whoever controls the process of identifying the next Dalai Lama controls the most important symbolic position in Tibetan Buddhism. And the Chinese government has made clear that it intends to control that process. In 1995, when the 14th Dalai Lama identified a 6-year-old Tibetan boy named Gedhun Choeki Nyima as the 11th reincarnation of the Panchen Lama, the second most important figure in Tibetan Buddhism, and the Lama traditionally involved in identifying Dalai Lama reincarnations, the Chinese government rejected the selection. Within days, Gedhun Choeki Nyima and his family disappeared. The Chinese government subsequently selected its own Panchen Lama, a boy named Gayan Kayin Norbu. Gedhun Choeki Nyima would be in his mid-30s now. The Chinese government has stated periodically that he is alive and living as a private citizen and does not wish to be disturbed. No independent verification has been permitted. He has not been seen publicly since 1995. He was 6 years old when he disappeared. He is known in the Tibetan exile community and by human rights organizations as the world's longest-held political prisoner. He is also, if the traditional process of recognition is valid, the Panchen Lama of Tibetan Buddhism. And when the 14th Dalai Lama dies, which, at his age, may not be distant, the question of who recognizes his reincarnation, by what authority, under whose control, will become one of the most consequential religious and political events of the 21st century. The Chinese government has already legislated the answer. In 2007, it issued Order Number 5, the measures on the management of the reincarnation of living Buddhas, which requires all reincarnations to be approved by the State Administration of Religious Affairs. The Chinese government has claimed the authority to approve the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. The 14th Dalai Lama has stated that he may choose to be the last, that the institution of the Dalai Lama may end with him, to prevent a Chinese-appointed successor from being used as a tool of political control. An atheist government has claimed the authority to manage the reincarnation of a Buddhist deity. The absurdity of that sentence does not diminish its reality. Why does Tibet matter to you? You are watching this from somewhere that is not Tibet. You may have no personal connection to Tibetan Buddhism, to Himalayan geography, to the geopolitics of Central Asia. Why should what happens on the roof of the world concern the person watching this video? Here is the answer. The glaciers of the Tibetan plateau feed the rivers that water the fields that grow the food that feeds 1.8 billion people. Those glaciers are melting. The rate of that melting is determined, in part, by decisions made in the capitals of the world's largest economies. The minerals under the Tibetan plateau will be extracted, are already being extracted to build the batteries for the electric vehicles that will replace the internal combustion engines of those same economies. The political precedent established by the absorption of Tibet, one nation's systematic destruction of another nation's culture, conducted openly over decades, without meaningful consequence, has been studied and applied by governments elsewhere. The silence with which the world responded to what happened in Tibet has emboldened those who would do similar things in other places. And the tradition that is being lost, the 15 centuries of philosophical and psychological and medical knowledge accumulated on the roof of the world, is not only Tibet's loss. It belongs to the repertoire of human civilization, to the full range of things that human beings have learned about consciousness, about suffering, about the nature of mind, about what it means to live well in a world that does not cooperate. When that tradition is lost, if it is lost, it will not be recovered. Unlike a species that goes extinct, a tradition does not leave a fossil record. It leaves nothing. Or it leaves what the exile community in Dharamsala is desperately, heroically, insufficiently trying to preserve. 80,000 people against a civilization of 1.4 billion on the foothills of the Himalaya, trying to keep alive what the mountain once protected. There is a prayer in Tibetan Buddhism. It is not translated well into English, but its approximate meaning is this: may all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings find joy. May all beings be at peace. It is called the Metta prayer, the prayer of loving kindness, and it is recited by Buddhist practitioners around the world in many languages and many traditions, in the morning and the evening, and at the beginning of every formal practice session. The monks in the monasteries of Lhasa recite it. The monks in the exile monasteries of Dharamsala recite it. The pilgrims walking the Kora around Mount Kailash recite it, step by step, prostration by prostration, through thin air and cold wind, and the specific silence of a place that is 4,600 meters above the world you know. May all beings be happy. They say it for everyone. Not for Tibetans, not for Buddhists, for all beings, including the people who are erasing them. That is either the most extraordinary spiritual discipline ever developed by a human civilization, or it is the most heartbreaking, or it is both. The Potala is still there. The Kora around the Jokhang is still being walked. The monks of Sera are still debating in the courtyard, though under surveillance cameras and with political officers noting who says what. Kailash is still unclimbable, still sacred, still circled every day by people who walked weeks to reach it. The tradition is still alive, diminished, constrained, watched, pressured from every side, but alive. In Lhasa and in Dharamsala, and in the minds of 6 million Tibetan people, and in the libraries of manuscripts that were carried over the Himalaya in the lining of a coat, Tibet is still there. The question is whether we are paying attention. Whether the world, which has many things to look at, many crises to manage, many easier choices to make than the uncomfortable one of caring about a place that is small and remote and whose people ask only for the right to be what they have always been. whether the world is paying attention. I think you are. I think that's why you're still here. If this story matters to you, share it. Not for views, because some stories only survive if someone keeps telling them. Subscribe to Rome Folios. And leave a comment, what did you know about Tibet before today? Because the first step toward changing what is happening in a place is knowing that the place exists. Tibet exists. It is extraordinary, and it deserves to be known. I'll see you in the next one.